Hey everyone, and welcome back. We're diving into a listener request today, and it's a really interesting one. You wanted to explore autistic fears, specifically the fear of butterflies.
Lepidopterophobia.
Right, lepidopterophobia, had to make sure I got that right. So we found this article from Cheap ABA called Autistic Fears, Butterflies. And honestly, before we got this request, butterflies always seemed, I don't know, kind of harmless to me, pretty even.
Wrong.
But this article really got me thinking. So, what is it about butterflies that might be frightening for someone on the autism spectrum?
It's a great question. And I think the first thing to remember is that everyone's experience with autism is different, right? So it's not that butterflies themselves are scary. It's more about how individual sensory sensitivities come into play.
You're saying it's not like they're like tiny winged monsters or anything.
Exactly. It's more nuanced than that. For example, think about those bright colors and intricate patterns on a butterfly's wings.
Which most people think are beautiful, right?
Right. But for someone who's sensitive to sensory input, all that visual stimulation can be really overwhelming, even painful for some people.
Oh, wow. Like that feeling of being in a crowded room with too much noise and you just want to escape, but it's like a butterfly doing it.
That's a great comparison. And then on top of the visuals, there's the way they move. All that flitting around, those unpredictable flight patterns.
Which is interesting because we usually hear about folks on the spectrum needing predictability, right?
Exactly. That need for predictability. For routine, it's about having a sense of control. So when something moves as erratically as a butterfly does, it can be really anxiety-inducing. It's not just that it's there, it's that you don't know where it's going to go next.
That makes a lot of sense. So we've got the visuals, the movement, but the article also talked about tactile sensitivity being a factor. What does that mean in this context?
Well, imagine how it might feel to touch a butterfly's wing. Those delicate wings, that fluttering for someone with heightened tactile sensitivity, that could be incredibly unpleasant.
Even painful for some people, I'm guessing.
You got it. So even if the visual aspect wasn't a problem, just brushing against a butterfly could be really upsetting.
It really highlights how much more there is to it than just seeing a butterfly. It's like a whole sensory experience,
Exactly. And then you add in the element of associative learning.
which the article touched on, yeah. How our brains connect experiences, especially when we're young. So, like, a child encounters a butterfly for the first time, and for whatever reason, it's negative. Maybe they're startled by the movement, or the colors are overwhelming, whatever it is.
Their brain links butterflies to that bad feeling from then on.
And that's it. Butterfly equals bad news, even if it was just that one time.
And that association can be strong enough to lay the groundwork for a real phobia to develop.
That makes sense. I had a horrible experience with a bee sting as a kid, and to this day, anything that buzzes, I tense up immediately.
Yeah.
It's like my brain just hasn't forgotten that initial fear response.
Yeah, it's like a survival thing almost,
Yeah.
right? Like our brains are trying to keep us safe.
Totally. So it's not enough to just tell someone, don't be afraid, it's just a butterfly. We're talking about deep-seated stuff here. But knowing all this, it seems like understanding the why is a huge step, right?
It really is. Because once you understand why something feels scary, you can start to think about how to deal with it.
Which is what I'm sure our listener is thinking right now. Like, it's one thing to know why something is scary, but how do you actually deal with it in your day-to-day life?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Knowledge is great, but we need action too. The article actually talks about some coping strategies, and I think they're a really good starting point.
Mhm.
But again, everyone's different, right?
No one-size-fits-all solutions when it comes to fear, for sure.
Right. So let's treat these coping mechanisms more like, I don't know, a menu of options rather than a checklist. One thing the article mentioned was exposure therapy.
This one sounds kind of intense, like facing your fears head on.
In a way, yeah. But it's not about just throwing someone into a butterfly garden and hoping for the best. It's a gradual thing. It's about increasing exposure to butterflies, but in a safe environment, at a pace that feels manageable for the individual.
So, like, starting small and building from there.
Exactly. You might start with just pictures of butterflies. Maybe choose ones with more calming colors, nothing too intense. Then maybe move on to videos, gradually decreasing the distance between yourself and the screen as you feel more comfortable.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've got exposure therapy. What about cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT? How would that work with something like this?
CBT is more about understanding and changing the thoughts behind the fear. It's about noticing those negative thought patterns like all butterflies are going to fly in my face, that kind of thing, and then working to challenge those thoughts.
So, like, if someone has that thought, all butterflies are going to attack. CBT would help them reframe it to be more realistic.
Yeah. Exactly. It helps you challenge those assumptions, those automatic thoughts, and replace them with something more balanced. You're not pretending the fear doesn't exist,
Yeah.
but you're learning to have a different relationship with it.
That's really cool. And it seems like those tools could be helpful for any kind of anxiety, really, not just for butterflies.
Absolutely. Because
Yeah.
when we learn to manage our anxiety, those are skills we can use in all areas of life. It's not just about butterflies, it's about building that resilience overall.
Love that. Now, the article also mentioned relaxation techniques.
What?
What are some examples and how would they help in this specific situation?
Well, think about things like deep breathing, exercises, meditation, or even that thing where you tense and release different muscle groups. Progressive muscle relaxation, that's what it's called. They can be really powerful tools for managing that immediate anxiety response.
Right, because it's not just the fear itself. It's the physical reaction it causes, too. The racing heart, the feeling of panic, and having tools to regulate those physical sensations can be really helpful.
Exactly. It's about recognizing those signs, those physical sensations, and having something you can do about it, which again can be helpful in so many situations, not just when you see a butterfly.
Right, it's like building up that toolbox of coping mechanisms. Speaking of support, the article also talked about support groups, and I feel like that's such a crucial aspect of all of this.
It's huge because honestly, just knowing you're not alone can be so powerful, especially when you're dealing with a fear that other people might not understand.
Exactly. Like, if you've never experienced that kind of intense fear response, it's easy to dismiss it as no big deal.
Hmm.
But for the person going through it, it's very real and can have a big impact on their life.
Totally. And that's where support groups can be so helpful, right? Because you're connecting with people who truly get it.
Who understand the sensory sensitivities, the anxiety, all of it.
Exactly. And just having that shared experience, that sense of not being alone, that in itself can be incredibly healing.
Totally. It's like validation is such an important part of the healing process. So, to recap, we've got exposure therapy, CBT, relaxation techniques, and support groups, all potentially really useful tools for managing this fear. And again, it's not about doing all the things, right?
Right. It's about finding what works for you. And I always recommend working with a therapist or a mental health professional to figure out the best approach
Yeah,
because everyone's different.
absolutely. Couldn't agree more. There's no shame in seeking support, in asking for help when you need it. It's a sign of strength, honestly. Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. We talked about the why behind the fear of butterflies, explored some coping mechanisms, but there's one more thing I want to touch on before we wrap up. Something I kept thinking about as we were preparing for this deep dive. If we think about the root of this fear, the sensory overload, the need for predictability, all that, could those same factors be at play with other anxieties as well, even if they seem completely unrelated to butterflies?
That's a fascinating question. And honestly, I think it's something worth exploring because those underlying sensitivities, those triggers, they don't just disappear in other areas of life.
Right. It's like by understanding one fear, we might start to see patterns, connections that can help us understand other fears, other anxieties a little better.
Exactly. And that broader understanding, that can be a really powerful tool for self-discovery and growth. So yeah, it's definitely something to think about.
Totally. So much food for thought today. Thank you so much for sharing your insights, for diving into this topic with me. It's been really eye-opening.
My pleasure. Always happy to chat about this stuff.
And for anyone listening who's struggling with this specific fear, or really any fear, remember you're not alone. Knowledge is power, seeking support is a sign of strength, and there's no shame in asking for help when you need it. Thanks for listening, everyone, and we'll catch you next time.